the doll that cried. When Sarah first saw the doll at the antique auction, she couldn't explain the pull it had on her. It wasn't that the doll was beautiful, quite the opposite. Its face was cracked, the once porcelain features worn from years of neglect. The doll was dressed in a faded, once elegant gown, stained with time, with intricate lace fraying at the edges. Its glass eyes were a dull, misty blue, staring vacantly into the space above the crowd. But something about it called to her. The auctioneer described it as an antique from the late 19th century, possibly part of a larger collection, but its history was vague, lost through the decades. Sarah, a collector of vintage oddities, had attended the auction on a whim, never expecting to bid on anything. But when the doll came up, she felt an irresistible urge. Before she knew it, her hand shot up, and the gavel dropped. Once the doll was in her home, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a mistake. Placing it on the shelf in her living room, next to her other collectibles, she stared at it for a long time, unsure of what exactly had drawn her to it. Unlike her other acquisitions, this doll made her uneasy. It wasn't that the doll itself was frightening, but its presence felt heavy, as though it brought something with it. She pushed the thought aside, telling herself it was just the eerie appearance playing tricks on her. That night, as she lay in bed, Sarah awoke to a sound. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, like a soft rustling. She blinked in the darkness, thinking it was the wind outside or the house settling, but as she lay still, the sound grew clearer. It was soft, like a child's cry. Sarah sat up, her heart skipping a beat. The noise was coming from downstairs. She grabbed her phone, using the dim light from the screen to guide her as she crept down the hallway, trying to convince herself it was her imagination. The crying grew louder as she approached the living room. She paused at the doorway, hand trembling as she reached for the light switch. With a click, the room flooded with light. Silence. Her eyes darted to the shelf where the doll sat, unmoved. Its vacant stare seemed to follow her as she entered the room, scanning for any logical explanation. There was nothing out of place, no signs of intruders, no source of the strange sound. She let out a shaky breath, forcing herself to laugh at how easily her mind could conjure up fears. The doll was just a doll. She had been dreaming. It had to be a dream. The next morning, Sarah felt uneasy but brushed it off as a restless night. She went about her day, but the memory of the soft crying lingered. She felt a chill each time she passed the living room, always aware of the doll's presence, though she never looked directly at it. Days went by without incident, and slowly she began to forget the strange night. Until it happened again. This time it was louder. The crying woke her in the dead of night, more persistent than before. It wasn't just a vague sound now, it was distinct, echoing through her home. It sounded like a child, weeping in sorrow. Sarah's heart raced as she lay in bed, the sound growing clearer. She could no longer dismiss it as her imagination. Grabbing a flashlight, she crept down the stairs, her breath shallow and her palms sweaty. The crying was relentless, filling the house with an almost unbearable sadness. She swung the beam of light across the room, and there it was, the doll, sitting perfectly still, its face bathed in the beam of the flashlight. But something was different this time. As she approached, she swore she could see a glimmer on its porcelain cheeks. Tears. Sarah stumbled back, dropping the flashlight in shock. When she looked again, the doll's face was dry, the faint light flickering across its glossy surface. She tried to rationalize it, tried to tell herself it was a trick of the light, or that she was simply too tired. But in her gut, she knew something was wrong. The next day, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the doll. She had to know more. She started by researching the auction house where she had purchased it, hoping to find some background on its origins. But the information was scarce. No one seemed to know where the doll had come from. It had appeared at the auction with little history, donated by an anonymous seller. As her obsession grew, she began contacting other antique dealers and collectors. After hours of dead ends, she finally found a clue. An older collector, a woman named Margaret, recognized the description of the doll when Sarah mentioned it over the phone. Margaret's voice wavered as she spoke, clearly disturbed by the memory. "That doll. You shouldn't have it," Margaret warned. "It's cursed." Sarah laughed nervously. "Cursed? What do you mean?" Margaret explained that the doll had passed through the hands of several owners, all of whom had met tragic ends. There were rumors of strange happenings, footsteps heard in empty rooms, cold drafts, and the crying. Always the crying. Each owner had reported hearing the doll cry before they died, as if it were mourning their inevitable fate. Sarah's blood ran cold as she listened. Margaret went on to describe the deaths: an old woman found drowned in her bathtub, a man killed in a freak accident, a young girl who simply disappeared, never to be found, and now Sarah had the doll. She hung up the phone, her mind spinning. The crying, the tears, it was all true. Panic set in as she realized she might be next. Desperate, she tried to rid herself of the doll. She packed it in a box and left it on the curb for the garbage collectors. But when she returned home, the doll was sitting on her living room shelf, just as it had been before. Terrified, she tried again, this time driving out of town and leaving the doll at a thrift store miles away. But when she returned home, there it was sitting on her shelf, staring at her with those cold, glassy eyes. The nights grew worse. The crying became constant, no longer limited to the dark hours. It followed her everywhere, growing louder, more insistent. The doll's face seemed to change, its expression shifting from blankness to sorrow, then to something far darker. She began seeing it out of the corner of her eye, standing in doorways, sitting in chairs where she hadn't placed it. Its eyes followed her, no matter where she went. Sleep deprived, and on the verge of collapse, Sarah decided she had to end it. She took the doll to a secluded spot in the woods, dug a deep hole, and buried it beneath the earth. She left it there, convinced she had finally rid herself of the cursed object. For the first time in weeks, she slept peacefully. The house was silent, no crying, no whispers in the dark. Relief washed over her, and she thought she was finally free. But the next morning, as she walked into the living room, her heart stopped. The doll was there, sitting on the shelf right where it had always been, its glassy eyes locked onto hers. And for the first time, the doll smiled. Sarah's scream echoed through the house, but no one was there to hear it. The police found Sarah's house weeks later, after neighbors reported a foul odor. The front door was unlocked, and the house appeared undisturbed, as if she had simply walked out and never returned. They found no sign of her, no clues to where she might have gone. But on the living room shelf, the officers found a single doll, an old, worn porcelain doll dressed in a faded lace gown. It sat quietly, a small smile painted on its face. And in the quiet of the empty house, one officer could have sworn he heard it, a soft, childlike cry, echoing through the walls. But when he asked his partner if she had heard it too, she just shook her head. No one else ever heard it.